Thank you, Acting Speaker, and I rise following the member for Thomastown's very comprehensive contribution to also support the Superannuation Legislation Amendment Bill of 2025. And as we know, and as I touched on yesterday, Acting Speaker, we always, on this side of the House, as part of a Labor government, as part of a Labor movement, whether at the federal or state level, have always been in the corner of workers, working family and those that seek to aspire but not be left behind, as the Prime Minister so frequently says. Because regardless of one's age or background or circumstance or income, everyone across Australia and indeed Victoria deserves that right to aspire and be supported. And that's why we have continued to support many measures since the very beginning of the great Labor movement and Labor political party to support workers, whether it's through ongoing advocacy for the minimum wage, regular wage increase advocacy, Medicare, pharmaceutical benefit scheme, paid parental leave, the NDIS, National Disability Insurance Scheme, higher education contribution scheme that let so many people from our generation in particular access university for the first time, and at a state level, work cover, which we were just talking about yesterday, the Transport Accident Commission, free TAFE, free kinder, the education state, free school breakfast program, free glasses and dental programs in school, and so much more. When combined, it's always been the Labor side of politics that's been there to make sure every part of our community has the access to succeed and aspire. And of course, when it comes to retirement, it's been the Labor movement and Labor governments that have driven and protected and preserved and solidified the importance of the superannuation system in this country and this state. It is very much the superannuation industry, the cornerstone of retirement planning in Australia, but it certainly was not always the case. Having grown from what was a niche retirement tool in its infancy, it's now grown and evolved into that universal retirement savings tool for Australian workers. But before superannuation became widespread and legislated, most Australians did not have a formal way to save for retirement. As set out by Nick Nicolaides in the History of Superannuation, October 24 analysis, a great analysis, I quote, "The idea of stopping work at a certain age wasn't something many people had planned for. They typically worked as long as they could, and when that was no longer possible, they often relied on family or personal savings to get by. In 1908, the Australian government introduced the age pension to provide support for those unable to work due to old age, but the pension had strict eligibility criteria, including income and residency requirements. Retirement remained unpredictable for most, with few having a structured plan for financial security in their later years. At that time, pensions were primarily reserved for government employees. In fact, the first superannuation fund in Australia was created in 1862 for public servants here in Victoria, but for the rest of the population, there was little to no formal support for retirement, and personal savings were often inadequate. Beginning as a benefit for government workers, it slowly spread to the private sector, with the Bank of New South Wales, now Westpac, setting up the first superannuation fund for private employees in 1915. And up until the early 1980s, Acting Speaker, superannuation still was far from widespread and wasn't transferable between employers. As a result, until around the mid-1980s, superannuation was generally limited to public servants still and white-collar employees of large corporations. By 1987, superannuation assets across Australia were estimated to be worth around $41 billion, with 32% of private sector employees covered. However, it was following that historic 1986 national wage case guidelines that contributions started to be added to some industrial awards, which significantly increased coverage to 68% of the private sector by 1991. And as set out by Helen Hodgson in her Conversation article of 2017, the superannuation guarantee came into force from the July 1, 1992, and of course thanks to the Paul Keating Labor government that introduced this measure, which the Liberals at the time federally fought tooth and nail against. And I should acknowledge the role, of course, of Bill Kelty at the time, the Secretary of the ACTU, and just what a momentous reform and legacy that piece of legislation still continues to provide us to this day. Award superannuation had then, of course, been built on since 1987 as part of the ACTU's agreement to trade off wage increases for an occupational superannuation scheme, and industrial awards were required by employers to contribute 3% of wages for a worker paid under the award to superannuation instead of receiving that money in their pay packet. And of course, the guarantee was introduced in 1991. It required employers at the time to contribute to superannuation for all workers earning more than $450 per month. The guarantee, as legislated, was 3% or 4% if payroll exceeded $1 million, increasing to 9% by the year 2000. And the superannuation guarantee came into force, of course, in July 1992. Superannuation assets at that time then grew to $148 billion once it became mandatory, with the mandatory super rate gradually increasing over time to 9% by 2002, 9.5% to 2014, 11.5% as of July 24, and is scheduled to increase to 12% by July 25. And the principle, of course, of superannuation is that very straightforward principle that it's the preferred investment to support retirees and reduce reliance on the age pension and federal government taxpayer dollars. Already from its infancy, the Australian superannuation system was heralded and still is heralded as one of the world-leading schemes, with the World Bank endorsing Australia's three-pillar system of compulsory superannuation, the age pension and voluntary retirement savings as the world's best practice for the provision of retirement income. And fast forward to today, according to KPMG's Super Insights report of 2024, Australia's superannuation pool of funds and assets have now grown to over $3.5 trillion as of June 23. That is a world away from the early 80s of around $40 billion. And some of Australia's largest funds, many of which are industry super funds, proudly representing the interests of workers, include Australian Industry Super, valued or managing around $300 billion of funds, Australian Retirement Trust of $255 billion, Aware Super $161 billion, amongst others. The average balance at the moment for members has increased from 90,783 in 2022 to just over now 97,000 in 2023. And according to the analysis from the Super Funds Australia Association, the average super balance needed at age 67 for a comfortable and secure retirement is $690,000 for a couple and $595,000 for a single person. However, as we also know, there's still a lot more work to do, which is why we're putting this bill forward today, but also in respect to the gender superannuation gap, which continues to exist, which on average sees women have about $15,000 less on average than a male counterpart account. And Speaker, it's always been, as I said, the Labor movement that's continued to support and fight for and protect superannuation in this country, always against all the best efforts of the Liberal National Party that's always fought against it and always fought to undermine it. As set out by a good colleague Andrew Lee at the federal level in August 22, superannuation we know was introduced by Labor in the 1990s and the Liberals opposed it and fought it then. People like Bronwyn Bishop continued to speak out against it. John Howard went to the 1996 election promising to continue with scheduled rate of increases, but then he froze it. Tony Abbott went to the 2013 election promising to increase the superannuation contribution, but broke his promise and didn't continue with those scheduled increases. As Prime Minister, Scott Morrison went to the 2019 election saying he planned to continue at the time for the legislative pattern of super increases, yet his right-wing backbench agitated for those reforms to be dumped. And don't forget, during COVID-19 as well, it was Prime Minister Scott Morrison who provided that access, which generations of young people will feel the consequences of in years to come, for young people and others to access their super. And at the most recent election, Peter Dutton's Liberal Party took a policy for the community for young people to raid their super for up to $50,000 in order to buy a property, making property more expensive by creating massive inflationary impacts, making young people poorer in retirement by missing out on those decades of compounded interest that they would benefit from in retirement, and also increasing the burden on taxpayers, the member at the table, increasing the burden on taxpayers to pay for more age pension rather than less, which is the whole intention of super, to support people in retirement. And that's why this bill is also before us, because we know, particularly for our emergency service workers in this state, they particularly do an incredible job to keep us all safe, and that's why we need to make sure we continue to modernise and improve the existing super scheme for those essential emergency service workers. The Cain Labor government in this parliament were the ones who moved the Emergency Service Superannuation Act way back in 1986, which was designed to establish that Emergency Service Superannuation Board scheme to provide and oversee superannuation benefits, investments and assets for persons employed in the emergency services. And it provided the framework to support and facilitate those super funds with the oversight of that board for members of Victoria Police, Metropolitan Fire Brigade, Country Fire Authority, officers from the Department of Conservation, Forests and Lands at the time, Ambulance Victoria officers and others. And as I said, as things change, we need to make sure that the acts remain contemporary. Today, the fund from those early days has evolved to oversee 124,500 members, overseeing, I understand, $37 billion in defined benefit and accumulated assets. And that's why this bill contains quite a number of reforms to modernise that scheme, to continue supporting our hard-working emergency service workers and leaders into the future. I commend the bills. Acting Speaker.